Okay, so in this movie, I'm going to show you how to use positioning to create a two-column layout. We're going to start with our famous horizontal navigation example of the Zen garden, although I still do have the Woo image floating here in the article section. And basically what we're going to do is we're going to do a lot of the things that we did with the floating um, two-column layout. We're going to take this horizontal navigation and make it vertical, and we're going to take the article area and we're going to put it to the right of the navigation. And to do that, we need to use positioning. So the first thing that we can do is let's change the navigation so that the navigation elements are not in one line, that they're actually one on top of the other. So to do that, we're going to go into the CSS, and we're going to go to the LI. And remember when we made the horizontal navigation, we had everything display inline that makes it horizontal. But if I change this to block, that's the opposite of inline, and then I go back and look at my design, now we're all stacked one on top of the other. Okay. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to shrink the width of this navigation down to 200 pixels. So I'm going to go to my CSS, and I'm going to say, in the nav style, I'm going to say width 500 pixels. Sorry, 200 pixels. Getting ahead of myself. And one thing I'm going to remove right away, actually, if you remember on the navigation, I set the padding to the right on the horizontal navigation so that there would be space between each of the elements when they were horizontal. We don't need that anymore, so I'm going to get rid of it. Okay. So let's see what that looks like. Okay, so now we have our navigation stacked on top of each other, and it's in a 200 pixel wide segment. Okay, what we ultimately want to do is to put this next to it. So we know we have 800 pixels to work with, but it's not quite 800 pixels because we also have some padding going on. So let's make this 500 pixels wide. So I'm going to go to the CSS, to the article area, and I'm just going to say width 500 pixels. Okay, there we go. Now notice, even though I've changed the width of these elements, they're still stacked one on top of the other. That's because they're still in normal document flow. I have not done anything to change normal document flow. And remember, this was in the previous movie, normal document flow is what HTML elements do when left to their own devices. They simply stack one on top of the other, flush left. That is normal document flow. And they do that until you change it, either by using positioning or by floating elements. So in the previous movie, we floated the left and the right columns. In this movie, we're going to position them. Now, anytime you use positioning, first of all, let me backtrack for just a moment. There are four basic kinds of positioning. There's one called static, which is normal document flow. There's one called relative, which is kind of a crazy concept, but it's useful sometimes. Relative says if you position this, give this a relative positioning value, and then you change its x and y coordinates, it's going to move this relative to where it would have been in normal document flow. And it's hard for me to demonstrate that here, but if you look at that Linda movie, Positioning Elements, there's a really good example of it. Okay, so relative positioning repositions elements based on where they would have been in normal document flow. Absolute positioning takes an element out of normal document flow. So it's like everything else that's in normal document flow that is not positioned is not going to see it. It's going to act like it's not there. And if you see a layout where there are elements stacked one on, like physically overlapping, and that seemed to be unintentional, it's probably because they used absolute positioning and they did not take into account normal document flow. We'll see what happens in a moment, how that works. The last kind of positioning is called fixed, and that's where you can position an element and it will stay in that same position throughout. Even if I scroll up and down, it will stay in the same position. Okay. The first thing that you would have to understand about applying positioning strategies is that all of the elements are positioned relative to their container, or to the one container that has some kind of positioning applied to it. This sounds very confusing, I know, but basically what this means is this. If I give this an absolute positioning of, oh, I don't know, top 50, left 200, then it's going to position this relative to my browser window. So it's not going to go to the top of my header. It's not going to go to the top of here. It's going to go to the top of the browser window and say, okay, 50 pixels down from that, 50 pixels, 200 pixels to the left of the edge of the browser window. If that's not what you want to do, if you want to position this element within the wrapper div, which is what we want to do, then you have to actually assign a position to the wrapper div. And this is actually what happens in practice. Usually what people do is they assign a relative position to the wrapper div. They don't give it any coordinates. They just give it a positioning value of relative. And that just says, okay, this is being positioned relative. That means anything that's inside of this thing is going to be positioned relative to the wrapper div. I know it sounds a little confusing, but that's just the way it is. Okay, so let me go to the CSS. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to say wrapper position relative. Okay. Now that didn't really change anything, and that's because now we're going to position the article section. When we position the article section, we're going to give it an absolute position. We're going to probably put it at about 200 by 50. We want it to fit right into here. Let's see what happens when we do that. Okay, so here's article. So I'm going to say position absolute. Okay, and now because it's inside of the wrapper div, the coordinates I give it are going to be within the wrapper div. So I'm going to say top 50 pixels, and I'm going to say left 200 pixels. Okay, let's see what happens. Woo! Okay, there's that crazy overlapping. All right, so what has happened here? First of all, by assigning an absolute position to our article div, we have indeed been able to place it 50 pixels down from the top of wrapper and 200 pixels to the left of wrapper. But it has actually been taken out of normal document flow, which means these other things that have no position assigned to them, they, as far as they're concerned, this does not exist. So they're just now stacking. If we didn't have this, we can imagine it would just be the header, the nav, and the footer, just stacked one on top of the other. So that's exactly what they did.